Welcome to today's webinar, Automating Compliance Defense in the Cloud. Our presenter today is Jody Scrifani. Jody is the Financial Services Industry Compliance Strategist for Amazon Web Services, and she's based in New York, New York. In this role, Jody is responsible for working with customers, government agencies, and service partners on global regulatory, compliance, and security requirements in relation to cloud computing. Today with us, we also have Kristen Hott to help with our polling and help with live Q&A. Our moderator today is Jen Kim, and she will be engaging with you throughout the webinar and answering your questions while Jody presents. Jody and Kristen, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Ryan. I am Jody Scrifani, the Global Financial Services Compliance Manager for AWS. In my role, I work with AWS customers and financial services regulators to understand and discuss best practices for the financial services industry. The interesting thing about my experience with AWS is in talking with customer compliance teams or regulatory agencies, we often start talking about how elements of cloud are secure, like networking and encryption. But once we start talking about shared responsibility and automation, it becomes really clear how much more secure and transparent a customer has over a traditional vendor, which is why I'm talking to you today about coding compliance to be a defense mechanism for the cloud. From this material, you should be able to understand how third-party oversight is changed by shared responsibility, experience how standards and benchmarks are used by customers, and understand how to create a persistent state of compliance through designing, deploying, and enforcing security requirements. I'm going to discuss this as a concept, and in order to implement, you'll need to decide how this will work into your organization's IT process. These steps are in order for a reason. We have seen customers take much longer or have to take a step back when the first two steps come after the last three. Keep that in mind as you listen. Since we are discussing this as concept use cases, I encourage you to visit the references noted throughout the presentation to gain more in-depth understanding. First to Kristen, who is going to introduce our first polling question.
To get a better understanding of the makeup of today's audience, please select the option that best describes your role. Are you in IT security? Are you part of the compliance organization? Audit? Risk? Are you a business executive? Or do none of the above apply? As you can see, the majority of our audience is part of the IT security organization, which is very interesting as we try and tie together the security teams as well as the compliance teams to drive automation in the cloud. Now back to you, Jody.
First, my experience with financial services customers using this process demonstrates that regulated, audited, and sensitive data will be better fit to be stored and processed in the cloud. This is because this process lends itself to software-driven automated compliance. I have even heard it referred to simply as guardrails. Let's talk about a critical element of AWS services, the shared responsibility model. We'll cover this quickly for those of you who are familiar with it. I find it important to always include because often when I give a presentation at a conference, I'm surprised by the number of people who haven't heard about this. Shared responsibility is one of the most important elements of understanding how to create a strong compliance defense. Working our way from the bottom to the top of the dotted line, there are security measures that AWS implements and operates, also known as security of the cloud. And those above the dotted line, those security measures that the customer implements and operates, which is security in the cloud. This means that customers will retain control of what security they choose to implement to protect their own content, platform, applications, systems, and networks no differently than they would for applications in an on-site data center. While AWS operates manages, and controls the components from the host operating system and virtualization layer down to the physical security of the facilities in which AWS services operate. So just to be clear, AWS is not an out-of-the-box service for security. You need to know for each service you use what your security responsibilities are and how to validate AWS's responsibilities. What's interesting here is whenever I meet with agencies and customers to talk about this concept in relation to governance, it often takes a few minutes before it really sinks in. So let's put it into context with an example. This is actually taken from the AWS Security Best Practices White Paper. So as I said, security is shared. When you use AWS EC2, the facilities, physical security of the hardware, network infrastructure, and virtualization infrastructure is AWS's responsibility, while you, the customer, are responsible for Amazon Machine Images, operating systems, applications, data in rest, data in transit, and so on. All of this you can get from the Best Practices White Paper I mentioned. Now hopefully that example puts it in perspective, but we have a lot to cover. So for more about shared responsibility, visit our website, aws.amazon.com/shared_responsibility. Cloud creates an opportunity for many things to happen. Because it is software-driven infrastructure, it can have software-driven compliance protections. This means that your design and deployment of the resources can be constrained to meet your organizational compliance requirements. We have seen every type of customer use this to their advantage. We'll talk about the use cases throughout. And as I mentioned before, these steps are considered to be in order because the first two facilitate how the last three will be executed. So let's walk through this. Step 1. Partner the cloud technologist and the compliance expert. I have been a compliance person for almost 15 years, and I can say I nor my colleagues have been given the task of contributing compliance expertise to do something the first time in a compliant fashion. I think cloud is a great opportunity to change this. At least in financial services, most regulations don't yet consider cloud. So our more mature customers are taking IT requirements meant for full-service vendors and diving deep on the attention of the regulation and seeking to meet that, rather than something that would not make sense for cloud and lose its value. You may actually have to do this kind of exercise if your own internal requirements call for policies that don't make sense for cloud. Let's talk about how you do this. Coming back to shared security for a moment, mature customers take their security and compliance experts and put them to work here. Together they complete an assessment of those controls they have on-premise and document those that are AWS's responsibility and those that have customer responsibility. Compliance can utilize a wide range of information regarding AWS's IT control environment, such as white papers, reports, certifications, accreditations, and other third-party attestations, which we'll talk about next. But the takeaway here is that your security and compliance subject matter experts should not be left out of this process. Their requirements, whether internally driven or law-based, will need to be included in how you implement and automate your controls and then document your risk assessment. Don't assume your compliance team can ramp up at the end. Get them involved early and often. And as best said by Capital One, we believe we can operate more securely in the cloud than in our own data centers. They didn't say this on a whim. They said this because they believed they could prove it. And that is what this step is about. Now to Kristen for our next polling question.
It is awesome to see that the majority of attendees today are closely collaborating between the security team as well as the compliance team. We've seen some great success with customers who have initiated the conversation between the two departments from the very beginning of adopting the cloud. So we highly encourage all attendees to do. All right, Jody, back to you.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, moving on to step 2. Integrating industry standards, independent benchmarking, and regulatory requirements. Let's talk about why this is important. Over 1 million customers use AWS's IT infrastructure across many different industries, and our services and infrastructure are implemented in the exact same way for every single customer. This step talks about how you demonstrate you are taking appropriate measures for security. And what's considered appropriate? Is it what Capital One thinks, or Chef thinks, or Netflix think? The answer is yes, it's all the above, right? Because as I mentioned before, it is the highest bar of security and you have control. Let me elaborate. Going back to shared responsibility for a moment. When demonstrating compliance, since security is shared, AWS and you, the customer, will need to have a way to validate our security to others. For AWS's responsibilities, this includes industry standards. AWS uses industry standards to benchmark and validate the IT infrastructure and services provided to a wide range of customers. This includes reports, certifications, accreditations, and other third-party attestations to assist customers in validating the AWS controls. Those utilized by our security-conscious customers include SOC 1, 2, and 3, and PCI DSS. AWS has millions of customers across the globe in a variety of industries. Not only do we need to implement security to the highest standard of our most secure customer, but we have to demonstrate it to a level that will meet the highest standard of our most security-sensitive customers. So think about that. We don't seek to have security to meet just one standard or one workload. Instead, we say to every single customer in the world, we have to achieve the security bar of the most secure customer, and here's how we allow you to validate that. For your responsibilities, it may include industry standards required for a business like PCI DSS, or to benchmark how you implemented security more holistically. For benchmarks, CIS AWS Foundation benchmarks give prescriptive guidance for securing AWS. This is best practice advice from industry professionals. Anyone can contribute, and the value is it is not just one person's opinion, or one industry like financial services, or even solely from AWS's perspective. Though I can tell you, we also contribute, and so should you. Putting all of the responsibilities together in order to design your secure environment for AWS, you need a plan. In order to articulate what that would look like for a customer, I included the FFIEC Compliance on AWS white paper written by Coalfire. The control area and objectives are identified first. Then you map to responsibilities, best practices, and auditing capabilities. Taking on the one on the screen, for example. Developing, implementing, and maintaining a security program is a shared responsibility. Customers can validate AWS's responsibility in this requirement from our SOC 2 report or PCI DSS. Here, Coalfire notes that the customer's EC2 responsibilities are for shared security. This is the not-so-secret sauce for demonstrating compliance responsibilities in the cloud. Because you have permanent supervision over your use of AWS and decide and implement the levels of security necessary for your workloads, it's important for your security and compliance departments to take ownership of the step and articulate the important security responsibilities. Now to Kristen for our next polling question.
So, we're curious to learn, has your organization leveraged the CIS benchmarks to implement industry standard best practices? Not at all. Under consideration, we have leveraged one or more of the CIS security benchmarks. We have leveraged one or more of the AWS CIS security benchmarks, or not applicable. It's great to better understand the usage of CIS benchmarks. I highly encourage you, as we continue throughout the webinar, if you have questions about the CIS benchmarks, to send them on in, and we can either address them at the end of the webinar if we have time, or we'll be sure to follow up with you to answer those questions. Thanks for your feedback, and Jody, I'll send it on back to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Step 3 is to use the review and assessment from Step 2 and create a master design that meets internal and external requirements. Just like the best prepared meals are done with a recipe, you should create a master design including those regulatory and compliance requirements you identified in Step 2. So what goes into creating your master design? This includes defining the structure you require in the form of AWS configuration values. Some examples include encryption requirements like forcing server-side encryption for S3 objects, permissions to resources or which roles apply to certain environments. I've seen customers design for ransomware by having a quasi-disaster recovery account that has locked up, tucked away credentials for minimal access. And everyone's favorite requirement, what kind of logging needs to be enabled, such as enforcing the use of CloudTrail on required resources. Here, I've seen customers tag or keep separate production accounts and development accounts where production was the only environment required to have logging. AWS provides a mature set of configuration options so templates can be available to continuously align your environment to your security controls. These security templates, or AWS CloudFormation templates, provide a more comprehensive set of rules that can be systematically enforced. AWS also has developed templates that provide security rules conforming to multiple security frameworks, like PCI DSS. For more information, visit our Introduction to Security by Design white paper. Also, more help to create this secure environment is available from our AWS Experience Architects and AWS Professional Services. Just contact your account manager or AWS via the AWS console. Now to Kristen for our last poll.
What are your greatest challenges prohibiting the automation of the controls throughout your organization? Is it inadequate technology, budget constraints, limited number of skilled employee resources, lack of leadership and board support, no comprehensive implementation guidance, or siloed organizational structure? This feedback is great to know as we can drive the development of more implementation guidance for you and for your organization, as well as provide resources so that you can better understand our security partner network, which is a great resource to utilize when you lack the skilled resources within your organization. But thank you for your feedback on this question, and Jody, I'll send it on back to you again.
Thank you, Kristen. Now you have your design for security, you need to ensure your users deploy this template continuously through software-driven enforcement. From a technical perspective, this includes enabling service catalog and enforcing the use of the template in the catalog. This effectively enforces the use of your secure environment for new resources that are being created and prevents anyone from creating a resource that doesn't adhere to your security rules. One customer I work with found this process significantly reduced the time needed to provision new IT resources for itself and its customers from months to minutes. Sometimes this type of instantaneous provision requires some reworking of procurement. If you have any concern on that, visit aws.amazon.com/professional-services/CAF. This is the Cloud Adoption Framework. It offers structure to help organizations develop an efficient and effective plan for their cloud adoption journey. The takeaway here is that you can set a catalog of approved resources that users can access via a portal. These resources are, as we discussed in Step 3, designed by your team of professionals to meet your internal and external requirements in a template format. The resource is provisioned in a compliant state, hopefully tested by you, and if so, each resource provision provisions off that template would require no testing before deployed because the template was tested and known to meet your requirements. This is the persistent compliance I had discussed before. If you'd like to get more technical, visit aws.amazon.com/service catalog. Lastly is step 5. Program a scalable governance and auditing program. One of my favorite benefits from this process, because you can use these steps to scale governance and auditing to keep you focused on actual issues and not just checking boxes. We talked about defining your security requirement, then redesigning and configuring them in a template in AWS, and of course, testing the template as part of your audit. You put them in a catalog state as a provision resource. Now, how do you know it's working? Assuming you turned on logging, AWS Config on the left part of your screen allows you to capture the current state of your environment. You can then compare them to your security rules. This is one way to provide audit evidence. You can even give your auditors secure read access permissions, as you can see on the screen on the right. You can use AWS config rules to run unique scripts, which enable audit automation for evidence collection. Customers I work with appreciate how this converts traditional manual administrative controls to technically enforced controls with assurance that, if designed and scoped properly, the controls are operating 100% of the time, versus traditional audit sampling methods or point-in-time reviews. This is the work product of your security and compliance experts. You should be able to measure, of the, say, 100 policies you have, how many are automated and only require notification-based checkups. There are a couple of good resources that talk about how to audit some basic control areas. For more information, visit the Introduction to Auditing the Use of AWS white paper and the AWS FFIEC Audit Guide. Also, as I mentioned before, if you need help, we have resources that work with global enterprise customers, like financial services customers, to get to this type of automation. Finally, your environment is up and running, and whether internal or external, compliance or regulators want to know the who, what, when, where, and why, we put together questions that are commonly asked when evaluating cloud adoption. These include, how is the entity using the cloud? The answer is not, we use EC2 and S3. The answer should be far more in-depth. I've seen work products from customers that explain how they approach shared responsibility, where the responsibilities lie for each of the services they provision, a graphic for how they architect security, and so on. Cloud is a great opportunity to have a document that supports your security stance and helps regulators or any auditor ramp up on shared responsibility. For 2 and 3, this is the entity leveraging credible third-party assessments and using benchmarks? Back to why this is important. These assessments are the validation for AWS's controls, but also can be used to benchmark your security structure in AWS. They're not set by AWS, but a collaboration of security professionals, often including your peers. For 4, how do they monitor use of cloud? As I mentioned, this is where security and compliance collaborate to automate compliance policies to have codable governance and oversight. And lastly, how has application logical access, resiliency, and governance changed? Here you have to be able to explain, of course that has, and you have better controls through forced deployment of compliance resources, greater transparency through logging that you turned on, and full monitoring of your IT resources because your security and compliance team collaborated to bake in security and compliance policies that can be monitored by AWS tools like AWS config rules or through our partner network. This is the path of most of our mature customer base, and sharing another thought from a customer here, there's a process that they take even after they didn't do it the first time. You should start here, but if you didn't, it doesn't mean you can't start working on it now and use AWS tools or partner tools to know what isn't currently set to meet the standards you defined. In several capacities, we've discussed these best practices with financial services regulatory agencies worldwide, and we know this is what they'd expect to see. We strive here for our customers to have the option to not only have a high bar of security, but to be able to demonstrate it as well. We've seen many of our customers, especially those in highly regulated markets, take these steps and make them work for their organization. Remember, include your stakeholders early and often. And one major customer expressed this perfectly. Quote, "This is a big paradigm shift for regulators, a big paradigm shift for compliance people inside organizations. You have to start being able to express compliance requirements in a form that's codable. What we're able to do is specify a particular policy in a way that is audible, in a way that we know is always going to be implemented every single time." Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all your questions. We were unable to answer all of them in real time, but we'll be sure to get back to you.